What happens when a uniform gives someone power, but their bias takes the controls? The cabin was quiet, too quiet. The kind of quiet that comes not from peace, but from tension thick enough to press on your chest. It started with 6 words: cold, clipped, and cutting. Get up now! These seats aren't yours, row 3A and 3B. Two black women in their 20s, stylish but understated, turned their heads almost in unison. Maya Daniels froze with her fingers hovering over her laptop. Her younger sister Layla pulled her earbuds out, her music silenced mid-beat. Every head in the first-class cabin turned as the flight attendant stood rigid, blonde bob unmoving, eyes hard. I'm sorry. Maya's voice was measured, but anyone paying attention could hear the tension hiding beneath her composure. You heard me, the flight attendant repeated. Her name tag read Pamela Huxley. Those seats are assigned to other passengers. You'll need to move now. From behind them in row 4, a white man in a pressed golf shirt leaned forward with a tone that dripped entitlement. Finally, he said, I told you something wasn't right when I saw them board. But before we dive into this moment, the one that spiraled into headlines, hearings, and history, let's rewind. 3 hours earlier, Chicago O'Hare, a December morning tinged with holiday chaos and overpriced coffee. Gate C-23 hummed with energy. Kids clung to tablets, couples argued softly over boarding passes, and snow-gloved travelers queued up near the screen, reading Flight 447, Los Angeles, 11:45 a.m. Sitting quietly off to the side were 2 young women who didn't need to be loud to command attention. Maya adjusted her baseball cap slightly lower, a trick she'd learned years ago. Keep your profile low, your steps even, and don't make waves unless you have to. She had the bearing of someone raised under scrutiny and trained to never slip. Next to her, Layla scrolled through her phone, occasionally giggling and leaning over to show her sister a meme or tweet. Their luggage was minimal, backpacks and 1 carry-on each. Their presence was polished but private. Around them, 2 men in dark suits with discreet earpieces positioned themselves in corners, scanning the crowd without looking obvious. Secret Service agents, but not the flashy kind. These ones blended in like shadows, because Maya and Layla Daniels weren't just any passengers. They were the daughters of Elias Daniels, a former president of the United States. But unless you recognize them, and most people didn't, you might have assumed they were just a pair of rich girls flying first class, which is exactly what Pamela Huxley assumed. Pamela had been a flight attendant for 17 years. She prided herself on intuition. She could spot a nervous flyer from across the terminal, a drinker from 2 words in, and a fraud from the way someone walked. At least, that's what she told herself. She'd seen people game the system too many times. Teens using their parents' miles to sneak into premium cabins, social media influencers bluffing their way into upgrades. So when Maya and Layla stepped into the boarding lane, she'd made her decision. Young, black, baseball caps, and designer sweats. Clearly didn't belong in row 3. Probably influencers, she muttered to her coworker Derek. Bet you $20 they used someone's points. Derek barely looked up from scanning boarding passes. They've got legit tickets, Pat. She frowned. A few rows back in the gate, Richard and Elaine Whitmore were growing restless. Richard, recently retired from running one of Chicago's most powerful construction firms, wasn't used to waiting. He checked his watch again and again, muttering under his breath. Why aren't we boarding yet? He asked for the 3rd time. Elaine dabbed her forehead with a napkin. This air conditioning is freezing. Richard's attention shifted toward Maya and Layla, who were still seated. He stared at them, eyes narrowing. He couldn't quite place their faces, but something about them irritated him. Maybe it was how calm they looked. Maybe it was the Secret Service nearby. Or maybe it was something he didn't want to admit about himself. When boarding was finally called, Maya and Layla rose smoothly. No rush, no spectacle, just presence. They approached Pamela, who took one glance at their boarding passes, 3A and 3B, and offered a tight smile. Not the warm kind. First class, she asked. Yes, Maya replied without flinching. Pamela stared for a beat too long before waving them through. Enjoy your flight, she said, but the words felt like a test. Richard and Elaine followed moments later. When Pamela greeted them, her smile grew wide and genuine. Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore, you're in 4A and 4B today. Welcome aboard. I asked for 3A and 3B, Richard said sharply. There must have been a mistake, Pamela replied, her frown deepening. In the cabin, Maya had already opened her laptop. Layla was adjusting her earbuds. Everything seemed normal, until it wasn't. Pamela checked the manifest. The names stared back at her. M. Daniels, L. Daniels. But her gut told her it was wrong. Not because of any evidence. Just wrong. These girls were too young, too relaxed, too black. From the back of first class, Margaret Cho, a retired public school principal, watched carefully. She'd seen this before. Different place. Same story. Assumptions, entitlement, microaggressions growing louder by the second. She watched Pamela lean over and whisper to Derek. She saw her glancing toward row 3 again and again. And then she moved. Get up now, Pamela said 40 minutes into the flight. These seats aren't yours. The cabin fell into a stunned silence. Maya didn't blink. I believe there's been a misunderstanding. These passengers, Pamela gestured to Richard and Elaine, are supposed to be seated here. You'll need to move, Richard leaned forward, smiling as if a game was being won. We've been premier members for years. We specifically requested those seats, Pamela's voice was rising. You must have been upgraded by mistake. Boarding passes can be misassigned, but our names are on them, Layla said, standing now. Margaret unbuckled her belt. Excuse me, she said, her voice cutting through the silence like a bell. What exactly is the issue here? Pamela spun toward her. This doesn't concern you. Oh, I think it does, Margaret replied, walking toward row 3. Because I watched them board. I saw them scan their tickets. I saw them walk here. Those are their seats from further back, another voice joined. I'm a retired federal judge, said Diana Reese, rising from her seat in 7C. And if those boarding passes are valid, they have every right to stay where they are. Pamela's face flushed, but she didn't back down. I need to verify their identity, she said. They claim to be Daniels, but we didn't claim anything, Maya cut in. That's our name. Still, Pamela insisted, anyone can claim to be someone. That doesn't make it true. More phones came out. Passengers began recording. The temperature in the cabin dropped as tension rose. From row 12, James Ray, a tech engineer, opened his flight app. Actually, he said aloud, the manifest lists M. Daniels and L. Daniels in 3A and 3B, paid and confirmed 3 weeks ago. A murmur rippled across the cabin. Pamela froze, and that's when Maya reached for her phone. She made one call. Hi, Mr. Carver, she said. Yes, we're fine. Just a situation with a flight attendant accusing us of fraud. Yes, she wants us to move silence. Then, I understand. We'll wait. Pamela's mouth opened, confused. Who was that? She asked. Our family's travel coordinator, Maya said. But you'll probably be hearing from someone else soon. Someone else indeed. Because while Pamela was spiraling and Richard was fuming, the pilot had just received a message from ground control, one that would change the flight and every life aboard forever. Captain Julian Cross had flown through thunderstorms over the Atlantic, handled emergency landings in Dallas, and once even delivered a baby at 30,000 feet. But nothing in his 2-decade career had prepared him for this. A message had just come through from ground control. Short but electrifying. Possible security breach in first class. Protected individuals involved. Secret Service notified. Monitor cabin. Be ready to intervene. He stared at the message, then again at the names on the manifest. M. Daniels. L. Daniels. Wait, is this? He whispered. Julian, his co-pilot Sarah Montoya asked, watching the blood drain from his face. He rose from his seat. You've got the cockpit, Sarah. I need to go forward. The cockpit door opened, and Julian stepped out into the hush of a cabin so tense you could feel the silence vibrating. The first-class section was frozen in tableau. Pamela Huxley stood like a soldier at attention, red-faced and defensive. Richard Whitmore leaned back in his seat, arms crossed like a man expecting justice to tilt in his favor. Elaine looked mortified but remained silent. Maya Daniels sat upright, calm but alert. Layla, standing now, had one eyebrow raised in a mixture of disbelief and warning. From several rows back, Margaret Cho and Diana Reese hovered like quiet sentinels, unblinking, unyielding. And across the aisle, passengers recorded on their phones, as if capturing history, which, as it turned out, they were. "Captain on deck," someone muttered. Julian stepped forward. His voice, deep and steady, rolled through the cabin with command. "Miss Daniels. Miss Daniels. Is everything all right here?" Pamela blinked. "Captain, I was just handling a misassignment. These young women—" Julian turned, eyes locking on her like twin lasers. "I asked them, Pamela." Mia spoke first. "We're fine, Captain. Though we were just asked to move from our paid seats because our presence made some people uncomfortable." Julian didn't blink. "I see." He turned to Pamela. "Step into the galley. Now, but, Captain, now!" She obeyed, face flushed. In the galley, away from passengers, Julian lowered his voice but not his intensity. "Do you understand who they are? I thought it was a mix-up. The name. It's a common last name." "No, it's not just the name. It's the daughters of Elias Daniels." Pamela's breath caught. "The former president." Yes, her eyes widened in horror. But I didn't know. There was no note, no flag in the system. "And that's the problem," Julian said quietly. "You didn't know. So you assumed." She clutched the wall for balance. "Sir, I didn't mean harm." "You didn't mean, but you did. You humiliated two passengers. You made accusations based on zero evidence. You endangered protocol and disrupted the entire cabin." Tears formed in her eyes, but Julian didn't soften. "You've been flying long enough to know better. We'll be making an unscheduled landing in Denver. You will be deplaned and placed on administrative review. The airline will take it from there." Back in first class, the atmosphere had shifted. People whispered, phones kept recording. Margaret Cho returned to her seat, but her gaze stayed locked forward. Diana crossed her legs and folded her arms, like a judge ready for closing arguments. Richard Whitmore leaned toward his wife, whispering, "This is getting ridiculous." Elaine whispered back, "You should let it go." He didn't listen. Pamela emerged from the galley looking shattered. Julian followed her out. "To our passengers," he announced, "an internal issue has been resolved. We'll be landing in Denver briefly to deplane a crew member. Thank you for your patience." He looked directly at Maya and Layla. "I'm so sorry for what you've endured today. You should never have been questioned, much less accused." "It's okay," Layla said softly, though it clearly wasn't. Julian nodded. "Your father's already been informed." Richard's head jerked up. "Wait!" "Their father?" Julian didn't answer, but as if summoned by fate itself, the moment they landed in Denver and the door opened, a man boarded the plane. Jeans, navy jacket, calm charisma that pulled the oxygen out of the room. Passengers gasped. Even the skeptical ones sat up straight, because walking down the aisle of Flight 447 was none other than Elias Daniels, former President of the United States. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't flash credentials. He simply walked with the poise of a man who'd spent a lifetime in rooms filled with power and had learned to wield his without raising it. He walked straight to row 3. "Hi, girls," he said gently. "Hey, Dad," Maya replied almost casually. "You okay?" "We're good now." He looked around. His gaze moved across the faces in the cabin, lingering a moment on Richard. Then he turned to speak. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "I came here not just as a father, but as a citizen." Everyone leaned in. "My daughters experienced something today that millions experience quietly every day. Suspicion, assumption, disrespect based on nothing more than appearance." He let that sit in the air. Now they're safe. They're protected. They have platforms. But most people don't. And that's why this matters. He turned to Margaret and Diana. "Thank you. You didn't know them, but you stood up for them. That's what allyship looks like. That's what courage looks like to James Ray, who had paused his code review to document the truth. You made sure the story wasn't twisted." Then softly to Pamela, who stood off to the side near the rear galley door, ready to disembark. "You had a choice. You chose suspicion over service. I hope one day you'll choose better. And finally, to Richard. You said nothing, but you started everything. That silence cost more than you think. Richard, shaken, finally stood. I, I'm sorry. I thought they'd taken our seats. No, Aaliyah said. You thought they didn't belong. A beat. Then Elias smiled. Not mockingly, not condescendingly, but with the kind of understanding that hurts more than scorn. That's the problem. And that's the work. To fix what we've been trained to see. He turned to his daughters. You flying the rest of the way? Yeah, Maya said. We'll be okay now. He nodded. Good. I've got my own flight out. And just like that, he turned and left. No fanfare. No motorcade. Just presence. Just a message delivered midair that would ripple for years. The cabin of Flight 447 felt different after Elias Daniels left. He hadn't needed to shout, hadn't needed to point fingers. His words lingered in the air, heavier than the recycled oxygen the passengers breathed. It was as though the plane itself was suspended between two worlds, the one that existed before his speech and the one after. No one moved for a long moment. Even the hum of the engines seemed quieter. Then whispers began, passengers leaning into one another, murmuring their shock. Phones kept recording, but the tone had shifted, from scandal-hunting curiosity to reverence. Margaret Cho exhaled deeply. I've taught classrooms for 40 years, she whispered to Diana Reese. But this lesson, this one will stay with me longer than anything. Diana, the retired judge, nodded. Because it wasn't just about law. It was about humanity. Richard Whitmore sat stiffly in 4A, his mind racing faster than the plane's turbines. For a man who had always defined himself by authority, by being listened to in boardrooms, by commanding men on job sites, the last hour had dismantled everything. He hadn't just been wrong, he had been exposed. Publicly, entire rows of strangers had witnessed his arrogance, his entitlement, his prejudice. Elaine, beside him, reached over and gripped his hand. For once, Richard didn't resist. He didn't argue. He just sat in silence, face pale, realizing how easily comfort can turn into complicity. Behind them, James Ray closed his laptop. He'd stopped coding hours ago. Instead, he typed a new file name, row3.json. He didn't know it yet, but the small app he would eventually build to record and document discrimination incidents across the country would start with that file, right here on this flight. When the plane touched down in Denver, the door opened, not to new passengers, but to men in dark suits waiting by the jet bridge. Pamela Huxley's stomach dropped. Her career, 17 years of service, her pride in wearing the uniform, had just ended in one humiliating sweep. She walked off the plane like someone heading to a trial. The eyes of every passenger followed her. Some glared. Some looked away in discomfort. Some recorded the moment with the same phones that had captured her downfall. Not one person clapped. Not one voice defended her. She didn't even try to meet Maya or Layla's gaze, because deep down she knew the girls she had dismissed, the ones she thought didn't belong, had just revealed her own unworthiness. Back in the cabin, Captain Julian Cross made an announcement. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We will continue to Los Angeles shortly. I assure you, what occurred today does not represent our airline's values. His professional words could not smooth over what had happened. Something irreversible had taken place. Strangers who boarded as individuals were now a community bound by witness. Margaret leaned forward to speak quietly to the sisters. I'm so sorry you had to go through this. But you handled it with grace beyond your years. Layla smiled faintly. We've had practice. Dinah added firmly. If you ever need a witness statement, I will provide one. I may be retired, but I haven't retired my principles. For the rest of the flight, conversations bloomed where silence had ruled before. A young mother in 6C told her seatmate she'd never stay quiet again if she saw something unjust. A businessman in 8A admitted he'd once ignored bias in his own company, but promised to change. Even James, who usually kept to himself, shared with strangers how technology could help amplify truth. The Daniels sisters sat quietly through it all, listening more than speaking, understanding that the power of the moment wasn't in their words, but in what others were learning. 2 hours later, just before descent into Los Angeles, Richard Whitmore finally rose. His legs trembled as he walked down the aisle toward row 3. Elaine followed silently, tears already streaking her face. Passengers watched, holding their breath. Would he lash out again? Would he justify himself? Number. Richard stood before Maya and Layla, voice cracking. I owe you both an apology. I let my assumptions dictate my actions. I thought I deserved more because of who I was. But the truth is, I acted like a racist. I embarrassed myself, and I wronged you. I'm sorry. The cabin was silent. Then Layla spoke softly, but with steel beneath her words. It takes courage to admit when you're wrong, but courage means nothing without change. Richard nodded, swallowing hard. I will change. I have to. Don't promise us, Maya added. Promise yourself. And then keep it. Richard returned to his seat, carrying more weight in that walk than in all his years running companies. When the plane finally touched down in Los Angeles, passengers deplaned slowly, many exchanging numbers, emails, or simply words of solidarity. At the gate, a line of airline executives waited with apologies ready, offering free flights, compensation, and hotel vouchers. But Maya and Layla refused most of it. This isn't about perks, Layla said. It's about making sure no one without a famous father or Secret Service protection has to go through this. And that message spread. Videos from the flight went viral within hours, exploding across social media with hashtags like Row 3 Truth and Who Gets to Belong. Newscasters debated it. Schools discussed it. Corporations scrambled to issue statements. But more importantly, ordinary people began asking themselves the same question. Who do we assume belongs, and who do we assume doesn't? Pamela, stripped of her wings, entered mandatory counseling. At first she resisted, angry at being made an example. But slowly, painfully, she began to confront her own biases. She eventually took a job at a community center, where for the first time she listened to people she once dismissed. Growth was messy, humbling, but real. Richard, meanwhile, found unexpected purpose. Haunted by his humiliation, he began volunteering at a youth mentorship program. What started as an attempt to make amends became something deeper. He launched a scholarship called the Row 3 Fund, dedicated to students from communities historically excluded from business opportunities. At the first ceremony, he admitted publicly, I thought I was the victim that day, but I was the perpetrator. This fund is my way of making sure fewer doors close on others. Margaret Cho went back to teaching part-time, now weaving stories of standing up against injustice into her lessons. Courage is contagious, she told her students. I know because I caught it at 30,000 feet. Diana Reese came fully out of retirement, establishing the Row 3 Foundation to provide legal support for victims of discrimination. Her name became synonymous not with her years on the bench, but with the stand she took mid-flight. James Ray built his app, which became a tool for thousands to record and report incidents of bias safely. His project was featured in tech magazines, but he always credited its origin to a flight where 2 young women taught us all what dignity looks like. And the Daniel sisters? They continued their own lives. Maya entering politics, Layla pursuing documentary filmmaking. But they carried the flight with them. In speeches, in films, in quiet conversations with friends, they returned to the lesson. Change doesn't come from silence. It comes from standing up. Years later, the story of Flight 447 became more than a viral video. It became a case study taught in law schools, business programs, and diversity training worldwide. Airlines adopted new policies. The phrase, "Don't be a Pamela," entered the lexicon as a warning against unchecked bias. "Be a Margaret" became shorthand for speaking up. And across countless workplaces and classrooms, people remembered the lesson of that day. Assumptions carry weight, and silence has a cost. At a social justice conference 5 years later, many of the passengers reunited. Margaret, Diana, Richard, Pamela, even the Daniel sisters were all there. On stage, they spoke not of scandal, but of growth, of how one moment, one mistake, One confrontation in row 3 had changed the trajectory of dozens of lives. As Layla said during her keynote, what happened on that flight wasn't unique. It happens every day. But what was unique was how people responded. Some stood up, some admitted they were wrong, and some began the hard, lifelong work of change. And that, perhaps, was the true legacy of row 3.